OK, the last thing we have to talk about before our networking intro tour is over is the idea of headers, and in particular, having multiple headers. So when you send mail, let's say we have Alice and we have Bob. Now, Alice and Bob, we can think of them as maybe they're CEOs. They've done very well. They appeared in all the cryptography lectures, and they got a lot of royalty checks. So now they're very wealthy. They're CEOs, and they don't have time to think about lowly things like sending mail. So maybe in our story, Alice has a message, and she wants to tell this message to Bob. But Alice is a wealthy person. She has no time for petty things like mail. So instead, what is she going to do? Well, like any rich person, she's going to tell her secretary to send this message to Bob. So she'll say out loud, she'll say, here's my message. Can you please send this to Bob? And then Alice's secretary will take the message and put it in an envelope. And in the envelope, the secretary will write that the message is from Alice, and it should be sent to Bob. So what the secretary has done is the secretary has wrapped an envelope around Alice's original message. Now, is the secretary going to get up and walk over to Bob? Probably not. Instead, the secretary is going to go downstairs and give this envelope to the mailman. And then the mailman might put this message in a box or the mail truck. And then that will have the address of Bob's building. And now that we have this message in an envelope, and the envelope is in a box with Bob's address on it, the truck can now drive the box from point A to point B, and now we're at Bob's building. So what happens at Bob's building? Well, first, someone has to unpack the box. So we unpack the box, and we see the envelope, and we give the envelope to Bob's secretary. And then Bob's secretary says, this looks like it's for Bob, so I'm going to unwrap the envelope. I'll take the envelope off the letter, and then I'll give the letter back to Bob. And now Bob has received the original message from before. So this is a little story for how messages might get sent from Alice to Bob. And it's something we'll see has a close relationship to how messages are sent on the internet. So once again, we have wealthy Alice here. She gives the message to her secretary, who wraps the message in an envelope. She then gives it to the mailman, who wraps the message in the envelope in a box. And then once this box reaches Bob, we take the envelope out of the box, and then we take the letter out of the envelope, and then Bob gets the original message back. That's the analogy for how two people might send mail. So why did I tell you this convoluted story about sending mail? Well, that's because this is how the internet sends packets as well. So now that we know that there are multiple layers of abstraction, the way that those layers of abstraction interact is very similar to the way that Alice and Bob here have interacted. So everyone communicated with the layer below them and the layer above them. So that's something we'll see when we see messages being sent in computer form. So one thing you'll notice right away is that when we went from the highest layer of abstraction, that was Alice, to the lowest layer of abstraction, which was the mail truck, the message got additional headers wrapped around it. So we started with just the plain old message. It got an envelope wrapped around it, then a box wrapped around the envelope. And then when we moved from the lower layer to the higher layer at the destination, when we moved up the stack, we started to unwrap or peel off each of the headers. We took the envelope out of the box, and then we took the letter out of the envelope. So what we noticed is that when the sender is sending the message, additional headers get wrapped around, and then when the recipient receives the message, they unwrap the headers one by one as the message goes up to higher layers, and eventually the original message with no headers is recovered. So when we sent the message, we went from higher layers down, and when we received the message, we went from the lower layers upwards. That's another thing that we saw. OK, so what we've seen is that each layer can have its own header. So for example, the secretary level header, that's this one right here, this one had to do with secretaries. It might say something like, the CEO is Bob, and that's who I need to send the message to. So it identifies people inside of this building, for example. But then down here, we had a different header. This was the mail level header, and this one had to do with street addresses. So we could have one header that has to do with office numbers or the names, and then another header that has to do with street addresses, and that's totally fine. And what we'll see when we go through the different headers and layers is that every layer has its own header that defines that layer's protocol. So for example, layer 2 protocols have to think about these things that we'll talk about. Layer 3 protocols have to think about all these things that we'll talk about. Layer 4 headers have to think about their own things. So each layer has its own header that speaks the language of that particular layer.